Welcome to a moment of calm. You don't need to do anything. Just get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let this story gently guide you to sleep. Let us know in the comments how many minutes it took you to fall asleep. Sweet dreams. For nearly 1,000 years, an enormous stretch of European history seems to thin out. Not just fewer details, but a strange absence, as if the record itself loses its grip. The period, commonly framed as the Dark Ages, is usually placed between the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 and the later surge of cultural and intellectual life associated with the Renaissance. But when you look closely, what stands out first is not darkness. It is the blankness. The timeline feels hollow in places where you would expect noise. Societies do not simply stop leaving traces. Even in hardship, people fight, trade, build, argue, write, and remember. Yet, across certain centuries, the surviving descriptions often read like scattered fragments instead of a continuous narrative. We are told that Europe sank into disorder and superstition, that meaningful progress stalled, and that very little worth preserving occurred. That explanation raises an obvious problem. How does an entire continent that once produced dense libraries, formal schools, major engineering, and sophisticated political thought appear to drift into near silence for generations? How do the echoes of minds that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world fade so sharply that later centuries must reconstruct basic outlines from scraps? And then there is the question that quietly changes everything. Who decided to label this era the way we now repeat it? After Rome's Western administration broke apart, the structures that once maintained public learning weakened fast. Civic institutions faltered. Funding for secular education shrank. Networks that carried texts from city to city fractured. In that vacuum, one organization remained coherent, organized, and expanding. The early church, later concentrated in Roman authority, did not merely survive the transition. It became the most stable system left standing. Stability, however, can do two different things. It can protect knowledge until the world is ready to carry it again, or it can become the single gate through which knowledge must pass. In the centuries after Rome's fall, the preservation of texts increasingly depended on monastic labor. Copying, translating, selecting, and storing. That work mattered. Without it, far more would have been lost. But the control embedded in that process mattered too. When the chain of preservation runs through one institution, that institution inevitably shapes what remains visible and what disappears. Languages themselves became a filter. The works that continued to circulate most reliably were those translated and recopied in Church Latin, an ecclesiastical form whose access was largely restricted to trained clergy. What could be read, by whom, and under what interpretive rules was no longer a public decision. It became an internal one. And when the only surviving copies of older material reside behind monastery walls, the past becomes less a shared inheritance and more a curated archive. This is where the unease begins. If independent, scholarly systems are gone, if secular libraries decay, and if the majority of writing is produced within religious contexts, then history naturally takes on a theological framing. Events are narrated to teach lessons, reinforce doctrine, and legitimize authority. Over time, a civilization's memory starts to resemble a sermon, not necessarily false in every detail, but arranged to serve a purpose beyond documentation. Even the early post-imperial record feels oddly distant. a moment as enormous as the deposition of the last Western emperor should have generated a flood of contemporary accounts, letters, administrative documents, personal reflections, competing chronicles. Instead, many later descriptions rely on brief notes, often preserved or rewritten long afterward. The deeper you search into the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, the more the record can feel like fog, broken edges, missing context, and long stretches where the surviving narrative becomes thin. What makes this especially striking is that the broader world did not stop recording itself. Across the Middle East and Asia, documentation remains comparatively rich and continuous. Courts kept archives. Scholars wrote treatises. Calendars and observations were maintained. In other regions, history did not seem to go dark in the same way. So, why does Western Europe appear to slip into a partial void? One answer is simple collapse. Instability, local conflict, reduced literacy, economic contraction. Those forces are real, but they do not fully explain the particular pattern of selective survival, how certain kinds of texts endure while others vanish, how one institution emerges as the primary guardian, and how later generations inherit a past that arrives already filtered. If you widen the frame, the question shifts. It becomes less about whether people in Europe were incapable and more about who held authority over what could be remembered. Because once control over memory is centralized, power changes form. It no longer depends solely on armies and borders. It depends on defining what counts as truth, what counts as dangerous, and what the population is allowed to know about its own origins. And when an era is remembered, mostly through the hands that copied the pages, the silence itself can become evidence not necessarily of nothing happening, but of certain things not being permitted to remain visible. As centuries passed, this quiet shaping of memory hardened into habit. What survived from antiquity was no longer a broad cross-section of thought, but a narrowed channel. Philosophy that aligned with theology was preserved with care. Writings that conflicted, questioned, or competed were far more vulnerable to neglect, loss, or quiet removal, not always through dramatic destruction, but through omission. A manuscript not recopied is a manuscript that eventually disappears. This process rarely announces itself. There is no single decree that erases an idea forever. Instead, there is a rhythm, a decision about what is worth copying, a judgment about usefulness, a preference shaped by doctrine. Over generations, those choices accumulate. By the time later scholars encounter the past, entire categories of thinking may already be absent, their absence normalized as if it were natural decay rather than selective survival. The result is a historical landscape with strange proportions. Certain figures loom large, quoted repeatedly, framed as pillars of wisdom. Others are known only by name, referenced indirectly, or mentioned as heretics, pagans, or misguided minds whose actual works no longer exist. We are told what they believed, but not in their own voices. Their arguments reach us summarized, refuted, or distorted, filtered through those who outlived them. This is especially noticeable in philosophy and science. Ancient inquiry was not unified. It was argumentative, experimental, often contradictory. Different schools disagreed fiercely about the nature of reality, ethics, matter, the soul, and knowledge itself. Yet, as medieval intellectual life developed, much of that diversity was compressed into a single narrative arc. Fragments of Greek thought reframed as precursors to theological truth, rather than independent systems with their own aims. In this reframing, complexity is smoothed away. Contradictions are resolved by interpretation. Questions that once stood open are declared settled. Curiosity is permitted, but only within defined boundaries. Knowledge becomes something to harmonize with doctrine rather than something that challenges it. Over time, this changes not just what is taught, but how thinking itself is practiced. When inquiry must always end in confirmation, exploration becomes cautious. When authority is inherited rather than tested, disagreement becomes dangerous. Intellectual life does not vanish, but it bends inward. It becomes recursive, commenting on commentaries, refining interpretations of already accepted texts. Innovation slows, not because minds are weaker, but because the cost of deviation is higher. This inward turn leaves marks on the record. Medieval writings often emphasize preservation and synthesis rather than discovery. They organize, categorize, reconcile. They explain the world as already known, not as something to be questioned from the ground up. For centuries, progress moves in careful increments, guarded by layers of approval. Meanwhile, what we call the Dark Ages continues to sound like an accusation against the people who lived through it, as if entire populations suddenly forgot how to think, build, or reason. But that framing misses a crucial point. The darkness may not describe lived experience at all. It may describe our distance from it. Because darkness is often what absence looks like when you arrive late. Archaeology quietly contradicts the idea of total decline. Communities adapted, trade routes shifted rather than vanished. Technologies changed form instead of disappearing. Local governance replaced imperial administration. Oral traditions thrived where written ones thinned. Life continued in altered patterns, not erased ones. What faded most visibly was not intelligence or creativity, but access. Access to writing. Access to preserved memory. Access to participation in defining what knowledge mattered. Literacy narrowed. Education became specialized. The ability to read and write Latin, the language of record and authority, was no longer widespread. For the majority, history became something heard, not read. And what is heard can be shaped far more easily than what can be examined directly. When a population depends on intermediaries to explain the past, those intermediaries gain extraordinary influence. They decide which stories are repeated, which lessons are emphasized, and which contradictions are softened or ignored. Over generations, this creates a shared sense of inevitability, that things have always been this way, that authority has always looked like this, that alternatives never truly existed. By the time the later medieval period arrives, the inherited past is already distant and partially obscured. Scholars work with what they have, often unaware of how much is missing. They build towering systems of thought on foundations whose original breadth they cannot fully see. And because those systems function, because they provide coherence and order, few are motivated to question the gaps beneath them. The irony is that when curiosity finally pushes outward again, when scholars begin recovering texts, translating lost works, comparing sources across cultures, the shock is not that the past was primitive, but that it was expansive. Ideas thought to be new are revealed as rediscoveries. Questions assumed to be settled reopen. The silence of earlier centuries begins to feel less like a lack of activity and more like a veil. This does not require a grand conspiracy to be true. It requires only human systems behaving as they tend to behave. Institutions preserve what sustains them. Power protects its own continuity. Memory follows the paths that remain funded, staffed, and sanctioned. So, the so-called darkness may not be a failure of civilization, but a narrowing of who controlled the story of civilization. And when that control eventually loosens, the sudden brightness that follows is not creation from nothing. It is recognition. It is the realization that much was always there, waiting to be seen again. By the later medieval centuries, the inherited framework of knowledge had grown heavy with certainty. Systems of thought were stable, internally consistent, and widely taught. They explained the universe, morality, history, and human purpose with confidence. Yet beneath that confidence lay an unspoken fragility. These systems depended on a narrow stream of sources, repeatedly revisited, endlessly interpreted, but rarely expanded beyond their accepted borders. When cracks began to appear, they did not come from rebellion at first. They came from exposure. As trade widened and contact with other regions intensified, unfamiliar texts surfaced. Manuscripts arrived from the Islamic world carrying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that felt both advanced and unsettling. These works did not merely add information. They revealed continuity. They showed that inquiry had never truly stopped elsewhere. While Western Europe refined inherited interpretations, other cultures had preserved, tested, and extended ancient knowledge without the same constraints. This realization was destabilizing. Ideas that had been treated as rediscovered miracles were revealed as long-standing traditions. Concepts framed as revolutionary turned out to have deep roots beyond Europe's memory. The problem was not that new knowledge contradicted faith outright, but that it disrupted the narrative of exclusivity. It suggested that truth had not been guarded in one place alone. And once that possibility enters the mind, it does not leave quietly. Scholars began comparing texts rather than merely commenting on them. Translations multiplied. Errors in long-accepted authorities became visible. Contradictions that had been smoothed over reappeared in sharp relief. The past, once treated as a fixed inheritance, began to look provisional. This moment is often celebrated as a rebirth, but that framing can be misleading. What occurred was not sudden enlightenment after ignorance. It was confrontation after insulation. Europe did not suddenly become intelligent again. It encountered perspectives that exposed how limited its preserved memory had become. The effect on historical awareness was profound. Chronicles were re-examined, timelines were questioned, sources were weighed against one another. The idea that history could be reconstructed through comparison rather than repetition began to take hold. This shift did not erase religious authority overnight, but it changed its relationship to knowledge. Doctrine was no longer the sole lens through which the past could be interpreted. It became one lens among others. Resistance followed, as it always does. Challenges to inherited certainty are rarely welcomed. Institutions that had defined truth for centuries did not relinquish that role easily. Debate intensified. Boundaries were enforced. But the momentum had changed direction. Once texts exist in multiple copies, in multiple languages, in multiple locations, control becomes harder to maintain. This is why the earlier silence matters so much. Not because it proves deception, but because it reveals vulnerability. When memory depends on a single channel, it can be shaped. When it flows through many, it becomes resilient. The Renaissance did not create resilience from nothing. It restored circulation, and circulation changes power. As literacy expanded beyond clerical circles, access followed. Merchants, artisans, and administrators learned to read not only scripture, but contracts, manuals, and histories. Writing escaped exclusive custody. Knowledge became something that could be owned privately rather than mediated publicly. The past was no longer only something told to you, it could be examined. With that shift came discomfort. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Certainty weakened. But something else strengthened in its place: intellectual autonomy. This autonomy reframed the earlier centuries. What had once been called darkness began to look like compression, not emptiness, but pressure. A long period where cultural energy was contained, redirected, and filtered. When conditions changed, that energy did not need to be invented. It released. The label Dark Ages survives partly because it flatters the present. It allows later generations to imagine themselves as saviors of reason, emerging from ignorance through their own brilliance. But history rarely works in such clean arcs. More often, it moves through bottlenecks. The centuries after Rome were one such bottleneck. Infrastructure collapsed, yes. Violence disrupted continuity, yes. But equally important was the narrowing of custodianship. Too few hands held too much memory. When those hands loosened their grip by necessity, by exposure, by gradual transformation, the stored past re-entered circulation. What we inherit today is still shaped by those centuries of filtering. Gaps remain. Entire voices are permanently lost. We will never know how many alternative models of society, ethics, or science vanished without trace. What survives gives us outlines, not fullness. And that is the lasting consequence of centralized memory. Even when control fades, absence remains. Understanding this does not require suspicion of motives or accusations of malice. It requires recognizing how power and preservation interact. History is not only written by victors, it is written by archivists, by copyists, by those who decide what is worth carrying forward. So when 1,000 years appear dim, the question is not whether humanity stopped thinking. It is whether we are seeing the era as it was, or only as much of it as was allowed to endure. That question leads to an uncomfortable realization. What we call history is not a neutral mirror. It is a construction built from what survived, and survival is never random. Time destroys much, but human choice destroys selectively. What is copied lives. What is ignored fades. What is forbidden disappears fastest of all. This means the past we inherit is already shaped before we ever examine it. When modern readers look back at the early medieval centuries and see gaps, they often imagine chaos as the cause. But chaos alone does not explain consistency of loss. Random collapse would scatter records unevenly. Instead, we see patterns. Certain types of knowledge thin out across wide regions at the same time. Certain voices vanish almost entirely, while others echo repeatedly through centuries. Patterns imply systems. Those systems did not need to announce themselves as suppressive to function that way. All they needed was priority. When resources are limited, choices must be made. When copying a manuscript takes months of labor, not everything can be preserved. When literacy is rare, not everyone can contribute to the written record. Over time, priority hardens into norm, and norm becomes invisible. Eventually, people stop asking what else might have existed. This is why later generations often misinterpret the silence. They assume that if no records remain, nothing significant occurred. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of filtration, and filtration always reflects the values of those who control it. In oral cultures, memory behaves differently. Stories adapt. Knowledge moves through people rather than pages. But oral continuity is fragile when power shifts. Conquest, conversion, and institutional restructuring break chains of transmission. When oral traditions collapse without written counterparts, they leave almost no trace behind. What remains is the official memory. That memory tends to favor continuity of authority. It emphasizes legitimacy, divine order, rightful succession. It explains disruption as punishment, trial, or deviation rather than systemic failure. It teaches obedience through narrative. Over centuries, this framing becomes so familiar that alternatives feel unthinkable. And yet, alternatives must have existed. Human societies do not converge on a single worldview unless constrained. Across geography, culture, and time, diversity is the norm. Uniformity usually signals pressure. The early medieval record shows remarkable uniformity in its surviving worldview, especially when compared to antiquity. The pluralism of ancient thought contracts. The argumentative tone softens. Certainty replaces debate. This does not mean disagreement vanished. It means disagreement stopped surviving. Once you understand this, the idea of a dark age begins to reverse itself. Darkness is not inside the era. It is between the era and us. We peer backward through layers of loss, translation, reinterpretation, and agenda. Each layer blurs detail. Each layer removes texture. What we see is not the lived complexity of centuries, but a simplified silhouette shaped by what passed through the narrowest point of preservation. That silhouette then becomes educational canon. It is taught, repeated, and rarely challenged at the foundational level. Students learn names, dates, and conclusions without seeing how contingent those conclusions are. History becomes something finished, rather than something reconstructed. But reconstruction never truly ends. Every recovered fragment, every rediscovered manuscript, every archaeological find quietly destabilizes the narrative. It reminds us that what we know is partial, that certainty rests on incomplete ground, that confidence in historical judgment should always be provisional. This does not diminish the value of what survives. On the contrary, it makes it more precious. Each text that endured did so against enormous odds. Each artifact is a message that passed through fire. But reverence should not turn into blindness. Preservation is not purity. When we mistake survival for superiority, we inherit bias as truth. The so-called Dark Ages are not an indictment of the people who lived through them. They are a warning about what happens when memory narrows, when access contracts, when too few voices decide what future generations are allowed to know about their own past. The real lesson is not about medieval ignorance. It is about modern humility. Because if an entire millennium can be mischaracterized through loss and filtering, then no era is immune. Our own time feels exhaustively documented, but documentation alone does not guarantee truth. What is archived, amplified, or erased today will shape how we are understood centuries from now. History is always being edited, even as it unfolds. And the silence of the past reminds us that the most important stories are not always the loudest ones. They are often the ones that never made it through the narrow gate of preservation at all. This understanding reframes how we should approach the past, not as a completed archive waiting to be opened, but as a damaged record requiring caution. Every surviving source carries weight, but also distortion. It reflects not only the moment it describes, but the chain of hands that chose to preserve it, copy it, translate it, and pass it on. When those chains are short and diverse, distortion is limited. When they are long and centralized, distortion accumulates. This is why historical certainty should always feel uneasy. Confidence often masks compression. The cleaner the narrative, the more likely it has been simplified. Real human history is messy. It contradicts itself. It resists neat conclusions. When the past appears orderly, that order is usually imposed after the fact. The early medieval centuries challenge us precisely because they resist clarity. They arrive fragmented, filtered, and incomplete. Instead of treating that as proof of inferiority, it should prompt skepticism about the lens itself. What we cannot see tells us as much as what we can. This also alters how we understand progress. Advancement is not a straight ascent from darkness to light. It is uneven, interrupted, redirected. Knowledge can stall in one place while accelerating in another. Ideas can disappear locally while thriving elsewhere. Civilizations do not move in unison. The Renaissance, often portrayed as a sudden awakening, was not a miracle of creation. It was a collision, a meeting between preserved fragments and external continuities, between what had been narrowed and what had remained expansive. The shock came not from novelty, but from recognition that the inherited past was smaller than the world had been. Once that realization took hold, it could not be undone. Even resistance confirmed it. The very effort to defend inherited authority revealed how much authority depended on limited access. As access widened, certainty fractured, debate returned, contradiction resurfaced, inquiry regained legitimacy. But the losses remained. Entire schools of thought vanished without trace. Entire social models left no written defense. Entire interpretations of nature, ethics, and human organization disappeared before they could be compared or challenged. What we reconstruct today is a partial echo, shaped by absence as much as presence. This is the quiet tragedy hidden beneath the label of the Dark Ages. Not stagnation, but erasure. Not emptiness, but exclusion. Not ignorance, but silence enforced by structure rather than decree. Understanding this does not demand cynicism. It demands awareness. Awareness that history is fragile, that memory is political, even when it pretends not to be, that preservation is power. It also demands responsibility, because the future will judge us by what survives, not by what we intended, but by what endured, by what was stored, repeated, amplified, and protected, by what was allowed to remain visible when time began to thin the record. If the past teaches anything, it is that control over memory shapes reality long after borders fall and institutions fade, empires collapse, doctrines evolve, but archives decide what comes next. So when we speak of darkness in history, we should be precise. Darkness is not an age, it is a condition. It appears wherever access narrows, voices shrink, and memory is funneled through too few hands. The early medieval centuries were not uniquely dark. They were uniquely filtered, and that distinction matters, because it shifts the lesson away from judging the past and toward guarding the future.